Hello and welcome to today's daily Bible study. It's lovely to be with you once again. My name's Geoffrey Farrer, Minister of Barnes, Putney and Roehampton Methodist Churches in the Richmond and Hounslow circuit. And we've restarted our daily Bible studies after Easter. And this week we're looking at the resurrection appearances of Jesus in the New Testament. We looked on Monday at Matthew's account of the resurrection. Yesterday we heard one of the accounts from John's Gospel, and today we're in Mark. Now, we believe fairly confidently that Mark was the first Gospel to be written, perhaps around 70 AD or a bit earlier or a bit later, depending on your viewpoint. But we didn't start with Mark, and I'll explain why in a bit later. So I'm going to plunge straight in because this passage doesn't need too much introduction, with reading from Mark chapter 16. And of course before that we've had the crucifixion, the death, and then the burial of Jesus. And then Mark gives us his account of the resurrection. So reading from Mark chapter 16, and as always there should be a link below to the passage from the New Revised Standard Version. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. So there we have the account from Mark's Gospel, a very familiar story, I'm sure, and a very one that is often read on Easter Sunday, and an account that we know Matthew and Luke drew upon for the basis for their stories as well, we think. And if we just treat the passage in its own right for a moment, there's much that we are familiar with from Matthew's account and the other accounts, and some interesting things to note. In the first verse we see that the three women who go to see the tomb, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome, are the same we see in chapter 15 verses 40 and 41, who saw Jesus die standing afar at the cross. And then there's the interesting little snippet of conversation that Mark records with the women going to the tomb and suddenly having this thought, well, who's going to roll the stone away? And to some people that reads like an anecdote, a memory that was passed on. You know, people saying, well, we were going to the tomb and we didn't know how we were going to get the stone away. And then we have the stone rolled away, the empty tomb, most importantly, the angel, which we encounter in the other Gospels, the promise that Jesus is risen and going ahead of them, and to go and tell the disciples. And there's a nice note here to go and tell the disciples and Peter. And of course, Peter, the last time we met Peter in the Gospels, he had betrayed Jesus. He had denied Jesus 3 times, as Jesus predicted before the cock crowed. But there already, one of the first things we hear is the promise that Peter is rehabilitated, his sins are forgiven, and that he once more is a disciple of Jesus, he is a follower. And so there's good news there for Peter and for us all. That's all very straightforward. But perhaps the most noticeable thing about Mark's account, and the feature that's most often commented upon, is the lack of an ending, or the seeming lack of an ending, because unlike the other Gospels, we don't meet the risen Christ in Mark's account. We are told he is risen, he's gone ahead of you to Galilee, but we don't see him. There's no recorded account of him appearing to the disciples as we find in Matthew, Luke and John, and, as we'll see later, to Paul. And from very early on, this has posed Christians and scholars the question, well, is this the ending that Mark meant us to have? Should there be more? And in most Bibles, you'll find there is more. There is what's called the shorter ending and the longer ending. And this presents in very graphic form the choices and the challenges that face the people who translate and edit our Bibles. And often there's a frustration amongst Christians that they say, well, we don't want to know about the details. What did Jesus say? What does the original text actually say? And the fact is, of course, that we don't have an original version of Mark. We don't have the parchment that Mark wrote on, in the same way that you can go to the British Library and see an original score by Beethoven. You can see what he originally wrote for his symphony, or an original manuscript from E.M. Forster or another novelist. You can't go back and say, well, what did he write first of all? We don't have that. What we have are copies, and often copies of copies. Now, the copies we have, we shouldn't worry about them, because they are of an excellent pedigree. We know that they were copied very soon after the events they were written, often much sooner than many ancient authors, and that we have a number of versions of them. And they agree very closely with one another in nearly all respects, and often we're only talking about a matter of a word or two here and there. But there are differences with the manuscripts, and so editors have to say, well, we'll prefer that version over this version. And they use various criteria, such as the age of the manuscripts, where they think they've come from, and whether they agree with the other manuscripts. But we see that most dramatically here at the end of Mark, where we have this longer ending and shorter ending. And the longer ending, we think, was perhaps written at the end of, or towards the end of the 2nd century AD, and the shorter ending to perhaps as late as the 4th century AD. But some manuscripts have them, but not all of them, and especially not the earliest ones. And so what we know is that this was not the original ending of Mark. And we know that not only from the manuscripts, but from the style and the language, which is slightly different from Mark. So that's a very long-winded way of saying that we are faced with a choice and a decision to make when we come to the resurrection appearance in Mark, at the ending of Mark's Gospel. Now, the first option is that this is not the ending that Mark intended, and that somehow the ending got lost. And there are several reasons people say that. One reason is the language on Mark. Mark, like all of the New Testament, is written in Greek, Koine Greek. And we think that Mark probably he wasn't a native Greek speaker like many people. He spoke and wrote in Greek because that was the language that most people used. And Mark doesn't always have the best Greek in the New Testament. Whenever any of us pick up a piece of writing, or I think we can tell something about the author, and we can say something about his style and his knowledge of grammar and the way he puts sentences together. And if we're honest, Mark doesn't always write in the best style. And what's interesting is how Matthew and Luke often copy parts of Mark's Gospel, and we find copies in there of stories and accounts in their Gospels, but they will subtly correct the Greek and make it a bit better. But even for Mark, the ending of Mark's Gospel is rather unusual in Greek. Literally, he says, and no one, nothing, they told, they were afraid because. Now, partly that's the way Greek word order works, but it's that last word, gar, in Greek, meaning for or because. And that was simply a grammatical faux pas. You didn't end a sentence in Greek with gar. You didn't end it in that way. And there are no other examples in Mark's Gospel of him doing that. And so that's led many scholars to say, well, he couldn't have meant to end like that. You just wouldn't end with that hanging gar, as it's sometimes called, the hanging gar, like that. There must be more. More fundamentally, there's the question of why Mark, who has very clear from verse 1, chapter 1, he says, this is the good news, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. He's very clear, this is the Son of God, very clear that Jesus is the Messiah, and who's depicted all the terrible things that has happened to Jesus in very graphic detail. Why doesn't he include an account of the risen Christ to show his readers that Jesus is truly the Son of God in this way? And many people have found that strange, and clearly early Christians found it strange, hence why they added those endings, because they thought, well, they must be a bit lost or missing, we're going to make it a bit better. And we know that Mark knew that Jesus had risen from the dead, because that's the reason the church existed, and that's why he wanted to tell people about the good news of Jesus, because Jesus had risen from the dead. So why didn't he say anything? That's option 1. Option 2 is that this is the ending that Mark intended. And most scholars now think that that is the case, that this is how Mark intended to end his gospel. We've certainly no proof that any additional text ever existed. The only thing we know for certain is that the shorter and longer endings are not written by Mark and were not part of his original gospel. And many commentators and many Christians have come to really love this ending and perhaps have preferred it to all of the resurrection accounts because of its honesty. And the fact is that, of course, these 3 women, who a few days before have seen this man die in pain and agony on a cross, are suddenly encountering a stone rolled away, an angel, and the dead man gone and apparently raised from the dead. And so their reaction of fear and terror and amazement is wholly understandable. And many people put themselves in the women's place and think, well, we'd probably have done the same. And it does seem a very honest reaction. And it also fits in with some of the themes we find in Mark's Gospel, notably the theme of how the disciples so often get it wrong in Mark's Gospel. Mark is, of all the Gospel writers, hardest perhaps on the disciples, and how they fail to understand Jesus and how they regularly get things wrong. And so this sort of fits in with that. And also concepts like what's sometimes called the messianic secret, perhaps wrongly, but in Mark's Gospel, Jesus often does things and then he says, well, don't tell anybody. But we know that people did tell people because Mark's written it down. And we know here that even though we're told the women fled and didn't tell anybody, they clearly did tell lots of people, because otherwise we wouldn't be reading the story today and Mark couldn't have written it down. So we are left then though with those 2 choices, and you can decide for yourself which you prefer. But again, like Monday, when we were talking a little bit about the differences in the gospel accounts, I think the most important thing for me here is the fact that Jesus was raised from the dead. Jesus wasn't in the tomb. The cross was not the end of Jesus' story, and that death, even death, could not hold him. And that to me is good news, and that is why Mark dedicated so much time and energy in making sure that we heard that good news, as he calls it, the good news of Jesus Christ. In Greek, euangelion, from which we get the word evangelist and evangelism, the good news of Jesus Christ. And that is good news indeed. So I'm going to leave you then with just a question for you to reflect upon today. What do you think about Mark's ending? Do you think it's enough, or do you think there should be more? And perhaps most importantly, does it matter? How does the ending of Mark leave you? Does it challenge you? Do you recognise yourself in the account? Do you still find the good news there? So I hope today has been helpful, and I'm sure I've said lots of things wrong because this is quite a controversial subject, so please be kind to me in the comments underneath. But I hope it's provoked some thought and discussion, and I hope it's helped in your own study and appreciation of the Bible. Before we go, let's just pray together. Loving God, we thank you for the gift of your scriptures. And today especially, we thank you for those who have worked so hard that we might have the scriptures today. For those who faithfully copied, for those who translate and edit and interpret, for those scholars who work tirelessly to help us understand them more. Guide us, we pray, in our reading and our interpretation and our application of your word, this day and always. Amen. Tomorrow, Jessica's going to be looking at the account of doubting Thomas in John's Gospel, and then I'll be back on Friday to think about Paul's account of his encounter with the risen Christ. Thanks for listening, and see you soon, I hope.